Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products. Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and today I'm here with a few of my Extension Dairy Team colleagues, our State Extension Veterinarian, Dr. Phil Jardin, and Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, Fred Hall, as we visit with our guest, Dr. Allison VanderPlaats from the ISU Vet College, around some recent information in the use of aspirin on dairies. So welcome back to our podcast team. And Dr. VanderPlaats, I know you've been on our podcast before, so I want to welcome you back onto our podcast.
Well, thanks for having me back.
Very good. So we recently had Dr. VanderPlaats on. Actually, it was yesterday that she recorded a webinar on the extra label drug use. And this came up because of the recent outbreak of avian influenza in dairy cattle, and specifically in California, where a lot of animals in one spot were getting aspirin. So the FDA has came with a ruling to tell us we can't do that anymore. And I'd have to say that Dr. VanderPlaats did an excellent job yesterday explaining why that is, the general rules, and then how specifically it applies to aspirin. So thank you very much for doing that, Dr. VanderPlaats.
Dr. VanderPlaats, let's kind of start out by what does extra label mean? Is kind of a general overview.
Yeah, so extra label drug use means we as veterinarians are using a drug in a different way than what is written on the label. So that could mean that we're using that drug for different diseases than are listed on the label. It could mean that we're using it at a different dose or route or duration or frequency. So we are in some way changing the use of that drug from its actual label instructions.
Go ahead and tell us about this October letter that veterinarians received.
Yeah, so in early or mid-October, I guess, FDA released a Dear Veterinarian letter. They've released many other of these letters over the years, particularly pertaining to specific drug uses or things regarding drug labeling. So this one was released on the 11th of October, essentially directly in response to the use of aspirin on these California high path affected dairies. So at the top of the letter, they lay out that they are aware that dairies are using aspirin to treat these cattle for fever and pain associated with the disease, but aspirin is an unapproved drug, and therefore true extra label use is actually illegal. We can only use drugs extra labelly if they are a approved human or animal product. And there are a bunch of other indications that go along with that. We can't just decide like, oh, well, I want to use this drug. There are rules that apply to it. So within that letter, they also outline how to identify drugs that are approved. So that includes the presence of an NADA or ANADA number on the drug label. And they also mentioned that we have approved labeled drugs or NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, for use in cattle. And so those would be a much more appropriate choice for treating the fever and pain in these cattle associated with high path.
So is this a new declaration? Because I know people have used aspirin for a long time. So is this a new rule they can't use aspirin, or just a clarification of the rule?
Nope, it's just a clarification of the rule. So aspirin has been unapproved for its entire existence. It actually predates the FDA. But no company has ever taken aspirin through the drug approval process. It costs millions of dollars. It costs years. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep a label active with the FDA each year. And because aspirin is a fairly low cost product, it really is not realistic for a company to want to pony up that money and time and research to put aspirin through the process. So it has never been approved. It just was not a real concern for FDA because previously, before this whole high path thing came about, we were really only using aspirin for individual cows on a fairly irregular basis. A lot of dairies are using those labeled drugs for treatment for mastitis, say, or for a sick cow with metritis or something like that. So aspirin was sort of a second line for many of our dairies. But now that it has become really, on some dairies, one of the mainstays of treatment, we're concerned about our food supply. We need to ensure that we have a safe and residue-free food supply. So really the widespread use of aspirin really prompted FDA to send out this letter and clarify, like, hey, it's never been approved. It's never been legal. We just haven't been as concerned as we are now with it.
So, Dr. VanderPlaats, what has the response been from producers that you've talked to or veterinarians? I mean, is there pushback on it, or are they in agreement with it?
Yeah, it's been a little rough. Because we have been able, without, much consequence really, to purchase aspirin at feed stores or from common veterinary suppliers and use it without any sort of, anything from milk co-ops or FDA or anyone really. So the response, especially for those affected California dairies where, again, we're potentially treating hundreds of cows a day who have high fevers and feel terrible and aren't eating and aren't milking and are potentially dying, there's been a lot of pushback because, well, this aspirin is potentially one of the easier NSAIDs to give. We do have a topical flunixin, so I can't say the easiest. But if I'm already drenching cows and I'm putting 5 to 10 gallons of water and electrolytes into a cow, it's easy for me to add that aspirin into that drench. And for those cows that are severely affected, why can't I use this? At a time when the dairy industry is facing really, honestly, one of the biggest challenges in, decades, there has been a lot of pushback, both from obviously the producers who are concerned about their cows' health and welfare, but also from the veterinarians who are trying to support those producers through this devastating disease. So it really was not a popular thing to put out, but I do think the safety of our food supply trumps those things. And we do have other options that we can use, but it's just for this to suddenly feel like to people like, oh, well, now it's illegal. Well, the reality is it's always been illegal. It just hasn't been of the same concern as it is now.
So during your talk, you gave some examples of other issues with or other products that kind of fall under this extra label use. I think you mentioned Baytril specifically.
Yep, I did.
How is that different than aspirin?
So Baytril is an approved drug, and it has label indications for the treatment of bovine respiratory disease associated with specific bacteria in beef and non-lactating dairy cattle, as well as prevention of respiratory disease in those animals. So the label indications for Baytril are there because it has gone through that extensive FDA approval process. Essentially, as a drug goes through that process, the company that sponsors that drug must prove that it is both safe for the animal, it is safe for the people giving that drug, it is safe for the environment, and it is safe for us at the tail end of that animal's life or after administration of that drug to harvest meat and milk from that animal. In addition, they look at efficacy as well. So in order for the company to print those specific bacteria on the label, they have to prove that it actually works against those bacteria. So Baytril is an approved drug. It has gone through that entire FDA approval process. But because the fluoroquinolone class of antibiotics is really important for human medicine, we cannot use Baytril in an extra label manner. So just to clarify, extra label use means that I'm using it for a different disease than what's on the label, at a different route, a different dose, a different duration, or a different frequency. So in order for me to use Baytril, I need to only use it according to label directions, and I can only use it for respiratory disease. The extra label drug use of that drug is not allowed because of its importance to human medicine. So bottom line is approved drug, but because it is so important, we cannot use it in an extra label manner. I can use it according to the label.
And of course, that's an antibiotic. So the concern is their microbial resistance. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So when we come back to the aspirin, we do have other choices. You mentioned
yes.
Flunexin and then also meloxicam.
Yes.
So how is that different? How do we go about using meloxicam instead of, or how do we go about using those to replace aspirin?
Absolutely. So Flunixin has two forms. It has an injectable form that is labeled for intravenous use, and it has a transdermal form that is indicated for topical use. So both of those are approved. Both of those have gone through that approval process. We can use them for different indications. So on the label of the Flunixin products, it mentions mastitis, endotoxemia, and what else? Oh, pyrexia associated with bovine respiratory disease. However, we really don't have a lot of, we really only have one real drug that has pain anywhere written on its label, and that's the transdermal Banamine. We don't have good options in a labeled way for pain management in cattle. So if I have a calf, for example, that is lame because let's say she got her foot caught somewhere, I don't have a NSAID that is labeled specifically for pain associated with trauma, but I can use Flunixin in an extra label manner, using it under that different indication condition, and I can use Banamine in that way. I could also use meloxicam. Meloxicam is also an approved drug. It does not have a cattle label on it. So we have approved versions for cats and dogs, and then we also have approved human versions. So again, because I don't really have a lot of options as far as pain management goes, especially for some of our more routine procedures where we're trying to reduce pain associated with, say, castration or disbudding, I can use meloxicam in an extra label fashion, and that could include the dog or cat version, or that could include the human version. If I had a version of meloxicam that was labeled for cattle, I should use that version, but we don't. So we are able to use those other formulations at this time. So meloxicam is a different process than the Banamine is, because Flunixin or Banamine has that cattle label on it, but we're using it for the different indications. Meloxicam does not have a cattle label, but we don't have a lot of options for pain management in cattle. So because we have other approved versions for other animals and for people, we are able to use meloxicam extra labelly.
You know, pain mitigation is becoming an important aspect of a producer's care for animals. And we had an interesting discussion during the webinar. You know, we need to be looking, tell me how we decide, do we need pain medication when we're trimming feet or when I'm docking tails with the lambs? You know, Is there guidelines for that?
Yeah, so ideally, even for those common processing procedures, we want to help control the pain and inflammation associated with those things. For a really long time, we as a profession and animal agriculture as an industry sort of ignored the fact that livestock experience pain. And part of that comes down to they are really good at hiding pain. They are prey species. They are trying to mask that pain so that they do not seem vulnerable to predators. But we know that, for example, during tail docking, when I leave a rubber band on a lamb's tail, similar to if you left a rubber band on your finger, that it does hurt. So we can provide pain management, ideally slightly before we do those procedures. But realistically, even at the time of performing those procedures, we can provide something like meloxicam or something like Flunixin to manage that pain and inflammation, especially for babies. They should pretty much get right back up and go nurse on mom. But if they're experiencing, let's say that we've band castrated and tail docked one lamb in one go, those little guys will lay around for about an hour and really act like they're dying because they're experiencing pain from two different sites. So if we can control some of that and offer some sort of pain management during these procedures, we can overall improve animal welfare. And there have been studies to show that depending on what procedure we're talking about, we can actually improve production as well, at least in the short term.
So what would be your suggestions for producers on navigating this, I guess, journey of looking through these labels and, making sure that they are using them appropriately and are approved? Do you have some tips or resources they can use?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say your strongest resource is going to be your relationship with your veterinarian. So one of the requirements for extra label drug use is that it is directed by a veterinarian. So just because we don't have a drug specifically labeled for a disease does not mean we can't treat the disease, but it does mean that your veterinarian needs to be involved in that process. So I would say that's your number one resource. But if you simply go into your drug cabinet and you look at some of those bottles, what you're looking for FDA approved products is those NADAs, new animal drug application numbers, or ANADA numbers, which is abbreviated new animal drug application numbers. The new animal drug application number, the NADA, is from the pioneer drug. So the very first company that introduced that product to the market gets an NADA number. And then as exclusivity periods end, other companies can formulate their own versions of that and submit them under the abbreviated new animal drug application. So they still all generic drugs go through pretty much the same process as those pioneer drugs. They still are heavily reviewed by FDA, but the presence of those numbers on the bottle of medication is actually required for veterinary drugs. So if you do not see an NADA or an ANADA number, it is not FDA approved. That is not to say that we don't use some unapproved products. So for example, epinephrine is an unapproved product. It has not gone through the FDA approval process. However, epinephrine is used in individual cases and for very severe disease processes like anaphylaxis. So to prevent death of an animal, we can use epinephrine on individual animal basis. If I were giving every single animal epinephrine in my 10,000 cow herd, that might be a problem. It depends a little bit on what the formulation is, but it comes down to that individual use of that medication for those other somewhat regularly used unapproved drugs. So if you're dealing, for example, however, with meloxicam and you're not using the animal version of that and you're using the human version, human drug labeling requirements are different, which makes this process extremely confusing and honestly annoying to navigate. So if you're in doubt, FDA has two resources that pretty much look exactly the same. They have animal drugs at FDA, which is a website that allows you to look up any animal drug by trade name or drug name or NADA number or anything else. There's also a human version of that called drugs at FDA, where you can search by essentially the same parameters. So in order, your veterinarian is going to be your best resource. Look at the bottles that are on your shelf. NADA is not the same as NDC, National Drug Code Number. National drug codes are assigned by FDA basically when a manufacturer submits their entire, it's called structured product labeling form that just tells FDA, this is what's in this is how and where it's manufactured, and this is how and where it's packaged. So just because a drug has an NDC number does not mean it has been FDA approved. So that's important to know. And then if neither of those are clear, then you go to FDA's website and you can look them up there. But I agree. It is a laborious process. And this whole aspirin fiasco, let's call it, have really highlighted the intricacies of some of these products and regulations.
Is there any recourse the industry has? Could someone go to the effort to get this done with a group of people, or is that not practical? Or
yeah, sure. If someone really believes that aspirin should be available for use and they can prove through multiple research studies under FDA's supervision that aspirin is both safe and efficacious, then sure, really any company or any industry group who wants to sponsor that can take it through that process. I don't see that happening, simply because the return on it, the financial return on it, is probably not worth the input that would be required to do that. But there is no reason at this point in time that someone could decide to do that. I mean, someone definitely could if they wanted to.
We've talked about this specifically with aspirin, but it's really with all extra labels. Tell me who the policemen are for these violators of it, especially from the producer or pharmaceutical firm side.
Sure. So you're talking specifically for extra label use, Fred?
Correct. And that's obviously what aspirin,
Yeah.
it's not labeled, but
Right.
there's other drugs out there that probably are misused with extra label.
Yeah, so there's kind of two different policemen. If we're talking about milk, milk falls under the pasteurized milk ordinance, which is overseen by USDA. If we're talking about, or excuse me, that's not correct. If we're talking about milk, we're talking about the pasteurized milk ordinance that falls under FDA. If we're talking about meat, that falls under USDA FSIS. So for milk, every single tanker load of milk is sampled, and then certain tanker loads are tested for a small sampling of beta-lactam antibiotics. And then if there's kind of other stuff going on or there's additional survey sampling happening, milk may also be tested for additional drugs, which may include nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories. For meat, there is a certain number of carcasses per day that they are going to sample from. And then depending on where those animals originate from, for example, like a state fair, they may have a more intensive sampling protocol. So if either of those detect residues, the first step is kind of a slap on the wrist. The producer is notified, and there's usually sort of a trace back visit that happens to see what happened in this situation. How did we end up with a milk residue? That milk or meat is discarded, so it is not continued on in our food process. It does not enter the food supply. But if you become a repeat violator, which probably means it wasn't just an accident, then you are put on a list of repeat offenders that is available, at least for milk, through the FDA website, and then for meat through the FSIS website. And it may actually mean that you're no longer able to ship your milk or your cull cows to specific slaughter plants or milk processing plants or co-ops because of those repeat residues. So at this point in time, specifically related to aspirin, there is not testing happening and there is not action being taken. However, that is because FDA realizes there will be a transition process from you cannot, or you have been using aspirin and now you cannot use aspirin. So that is not to say that they are not working on those things and getting their ducks in a row to start sampling heavily and maybe make some actions or enforcement actions in relation to that.
Well, thanks, Dr. VanderPlaats, for clarifying this information. I think it's been really helpful just to kind of walk through this process, understand the reasons behind this directive, and also kind of help producers understand where they can go for resources, and obviously being able to reach out to their veterinarian for further clarification. As we all know, each farm is going to be different as far as what, treatment protocols. And I think that's really offers a good time for producers to review their treatment protocols with their veterinarian. And maybe they need to be updating some of those as they go along here. So just want to remind the listeners here that we will include the webinar link in the show notes. So if you want to go and view that webinar and see some of those visuals that Dr. VanderPlaats was explaining, you can go review that. So as we wrap up here today, Dr. Jardin or Dr. VanderPlaats, any last key takeaways or messages that you want to send out?
I think just, taking that relationship with your veterinarian, it is a professional relationship and they are there to provide guidance, but realize that this has been a learning process for a lot of us as well. So we will not have all the answers, but we are a good resource for all of our producers. And yeah, this has been an interesting little journey that we've gone on the last couple months.
Yeah, I think the producers should realize that it's not the end of the world to not have aspirin either. We do have approved good choices. It's not like the FDA is making us do something we totally can't handle.
Absolutely. I agree with that 100%.
Thanks for being on here today, and we look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jen and Fred and Allison.
Thanks for having me.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.